Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with yet another edition of our weekly review of international events, which is carefully compiled for you, dear aspirants of civil service examinations. We hope you will find it useful as well as entertaining. The event that literally shook the world last week was a massive explosion that took place in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. 275,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, we are told, was stored in the port, a highly explosive material. It is used for fertilizers in agriculture as well as to make improvised explosive devices, bomb making, etc. Nobody knows why this highly hazardous material was stored in such a strategic location, and speculation is rife that what created the explosion. Some people suspected that it may have been a bomb directed at Lebanon's Hezbollah from Israel. Israeli government was very quick to say that it had nothing to do with this. Was it an accident? Was it stored there with connivance of the Lebanese government? Was it Hezbollah, which is described as a state within a state, that was responsible for this? But whatever is this, it was a massively destructive event. Traumatic. More than 150 people lost their lives, 60 people are missing, more than 5,000 people were seriously injured, 300,000, no less, people were rendered homeless, and the explosion was so massive that it was registered as an earthquake of 3.3 on the Richter scale, and the blast was heard as far off as Cyprus, which is 250 kilometers away almost. Window panes were shattered, buildings crumbled. Unfortunately, Lebanon before this blast was also dodging on the verge of disaster. Its economy had collapsed, it was reeling under the coronavirus, corruption was rampant, there was malnutrition, inflation was spiraling, and people were wondering whether the state would survive or was already in a state where it should be declared as a failed state. Now, Lebanon is not a very large country. The population is 6.8 million. The total area it occupies is a little over 10,500 square kilometers. So why should the world be so worried about what is happening to this country, which was already in all kinds of difficult straits? A little background is in place. Lebanon is inheritor to a most ancient civilization of the Phoenicians. And Phoenicians were a very sophisticated cosmopolitan civilization maintaining international ties as early as 4,000 to 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. It has been a crucible of cultures. This is where Christianity and Islam have intermingled. This is where most people think this is an Arab country. It has many affinities with the Arab world, but it has many significant differences also. Its population is almost divided half between the Christians of Roman Catholic faith, Christians of Eastern Orthodox faith, and the other half, which is the Muslim population, also is again divided very evenly between the Sunnis and the Shias and the various small sects within therein. This was a French colony, a French mandate between the end of the First World War and the closure of the Second World War. For almost from 1920 to 1945, this was under French influence. Now, this is partly what explains that at the moment the people of Lebanon, very dissatisfied with their government, have signed a petition which has been signed already as we speak to you by over 55,000 people who want France to come back, reassert its mandate, and try to bring back the country to good health. The French president was quick to come to Lebanon, promise help, humanitarian help, and also said that he would try to bring around the international community to the help of Lebanese. He was welcomed far more because people, grief-stricken, suddenly pointed fingers at their government that their president was missing. The prime minister was making vague noises. The prime minister, of course, promised that the guilty would be punished, but nobody believes that the guilty ever will be identified. Forget about their punishing. The credibility of the present Lebanese government is very low. They believe that it's a corrupt government. Everything which has gone wrong in the country is because of them, including the storing of this hazardous material for whatever reason in the port. Now, the preliminary information which has trickled down tells us the customs had stored it here. The courts had asked them against their protest to keep it there because the court case was on, and one doesn't even know whether there was pilferage. It is also being told that there were fireworks stored next to it. And was it an accidental spark that triggered the conflagration? Was it sabotage? Was it enemy action? This will take a long time to come. Already as it is, the French have said that they will undertake an investigation. The British have offered that they will undertake an investigation. The Americans have said that they will chip in. And of course, the Lebanese government has said that it will do that. But nobody believes the Lebanese government is credible, and they are looking forward to international investigation to bring out the truth. Now, what happens in this case is that if Lebanese cannot get over this, let's say, the last straw on the back of the camel, it is going to destabilize the whole nation. Because this is where Hezbollah was working as a state within a state. After the French moved out in 1945, after their mandate was over, this country had to suffer occupation from Syria, occupation from Israel, and unfortunately, the Palestinians who were persecuted moved in large numbers, millions, to Lebanon. This is where the Palestinian rebels targeting Israel drew the ire of Israel against this. Hezbollah, which calls itself the Army of God, has been fighting shoulder to shoulder against ISIS in various military theaters in Middle East. Now, what happens to all this? And unfortunately, Lebanon is a country dependent on tourism for its economic welfare. Its economy depends to a very large extent on the remittances sent by Lebanese skilled workmen outside the country. They have a reputation of being excellent financial operators, excellent bankers, but all this in one stroke after this blast seems probably will never be repaired back in reasonable time for Lebanon to get back on the rails. So this is a major challenge to stability of the whole region, which stray incident, if you call it a stray incident or an accident, has triggered. In South Asia, arguably the most significant event was the elections in Sri Lanka. Now, nobody was in any doubt that the Rajapaksa family will emerge victorious. One brother is the president, the other was an interim prime minister who had earlier served as a president, Mahinda Rajapaksa. And they thought that the question really was whether the party, the Sri Lanka People's Movement, would gain a two-third majority, which would allow them to amend the constitution and restore the powers of the executive president, and the devolution of powers which had taken place in their predecessors' time, partly sharing the powers with parliament or with other constitutional institutions, would be nullified. Now, people have very strong views about the Rajapaksa family. They do remember gratefully that this was the government, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and when his younger brother, who's now Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who's now the president, used to be the defense minister, had vanquished the Leyte terrorists and ended a 26-year-old bloody civil war in the island. But at the same time, there have been accusations that during this victory over the Leyte, many human rights violations were committed, many innocent Tamils lost their lives, and the promises given that power would devolve after the civil war to the Tamil minority in the Jaffna region have not been fulfilled. There also been accusation that the Rajapaksa family is authoritarian, dictatorial, and they of course are Dionists and they don't brook any opposition. The freedom of expression is slowly being eroded. There is almost some kind of an accusation of a police Raj. But let's be fair to it. As long as the Leyte was unleashing its violence, not only in Sri Lanka, partly in India, and Indian ex-Prime Minister lost his life because of that. During an election campaign, Rajiv Gandhi, the critics and opponents of Prabhakaran were murdered in foreign lands. Nobody was raising an eyebrow, and people were saying that, look, Leyte is a terribly ferocious, one of the most brutal terrorist organizations in the world. Now, you can't fight terrorists of this kind with your hands behind your back and preaching and practicing Buddhist philosophy or Gandhian strategy of civil disobedience. Now, whenever armed forces are used against terrorists, there are bound to be violations on both sides of human rights. Now, ever since Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president, he has been put in the dock by the Western countries who have said that there should be truth and reconciliation, there should be inquiry against people who committed violation of human rights and war crimes, they should be punished, and then only a process of peace, stable peace, can begin. But nobody asked these questions of America in Afghanistan, America in Iraq, America in Syria, America in Libya, places like Abu Ghraib, or much before that, even United Kingdom, which was in the forefront of criticizing Sri Lanka and Rajapaksa. Their war against Ireland was full of brutalities. We are not getting back into the colonial regime. So that's one part. So I think these double standards should be not applied to third world smaller nations which are violated with impunity the laws of war and laws of human rights protection, when a large country like either China is concerned, Russia is concerned, America is concerned, or anybody else is concerned. Let's get that out of our system. The second interesting part is that the Rajapaksa family is accused of being a dynast. But let's again be honest that in South Asian context, why only in South Asian context? If we look elsewhere, there has been dynastic succession in the leadership legitimized by general elections. Even in the island of Sri Lanka, there was the Bandaranaike family, then there was the Jayawardene family, then came the Rajapaksa family. And the Rajapaksa family has been active in politics for quite some time. He was a leader of opposition for a long time, Mahinda Rajapaksa. His father was a member of the parliament. Then when he became the president, obviously he inherited the post at a time when the country was going through an emergency and hard measures were called. What made him a little unpopular was the way he treated General Fonseca, who was the chief of the army staff, when Leyte was defeated. Now, this is not to be a defense of either Mahinda Rajapaksa or his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa or his family. In the event, what happened in these recent elections, they missed the two-third majority by a whisker. They got just 5 short of the two-third majority, and 6 members of the Rajapaksa family ended up in the parliament. What was not expected was, besides the scale of the landslide, the total annihilation of the opposition in Sri Lanka, which is not a healthy sign for any democracy, but probably the opposition itself is responsible for committing this harakiri or suicide, whatever you may like to call it. The oldest political party in Sri Lanka, the United National Party, failed to register anything. And the leader of the party, who had for 4.5 decades never lost an election in parliament, lost his own seat this time, Ranil Wickremesinghe. And also the party now finds various excuses. Deceased, assassinated President Premadasa's son took away half the party with him, and he got 52 seats in the parliament, all right. But this succeeded in annihilating the oldest party in Sri Lanka. Also in the northern region, the Tamil National Alliance, the number of seats won by them in the last election was drastically reduced. So what we are witnessing is not only the dynastic rule being perpetuated, maybe the authoritarian rule being perpetuated, constitution being amended to change the democracy in that island. That is that island's prerogative to do what they want after such a massive mandate. The interesting part is this, that what kind of external relations Rajapaksa's government now will follow. Now some people are thinking that there would be muscular singlism, but the problem is, if the majority of the people have given the mandate in favor of a single culturally dominated government to be there, and they are not worried about any other minority appeasement, they think enough is enough, and partly again the minorities are to blame. It is not only the Tamil versus the Sinhalas. Last April during the Easter time, an Islamic fanatical jihadi movement struck a church and many innocent lives were lost. So this kind of a Muslim Sinhala confrontation, which was not there earlier, also is now surfaced there. So I think if there are deliberate provocations, this again is not a defense of Rajapaksa family, but one can understand how the reaction to the minority violence takes place, and also in measure which is disproportionate violence are targeted against them. The Jan Vimukti Peramuna, which was the People's Liberation Front, inspired by Marxists, again has shrunk in political power. So what we are likely to see in coming days in Sri Lanka is a government which has a clear mandate from the people. They do not wish to be distracted by Western notions of secularism, pluralism, etc. They want steady economic process. They also have given their approval to Rajapaksa brothers, because not only they ended the Leyte civil war and the Leyte violence, they also have managed to control the coronavirus. There have been less than a dozen odd deaths in Sri Lanka, and the number of cases have been very severely limited. Now Sri Lanka depends to a very large extent on its tourism. So I think the restoration of the tourism, if the rest of the world is in a position to travel to this beautiful island of serendipity, would probably set Sri Lanka on a piece of reconstruction and economic recovery. As far as India is concerned, much too long, India has mortgaged its policy towards Sri Lanka to trying to placate the Dravidian political parties in Tamil Nadu, and this has been a bone of contention. Now, Mahinda Rajapaksa when he was a president, when he's re-elected, leaves no stone unturned to convey to India that he wants friendly relationships with India. Although he did once point finger to India and say that it was due to the interference of India that he lost election, a surprise loss which he suffered 2 years back. But the point is that he says India is family and China is friend. But of course, one has to take this with a pinch of salt, because during his presidency, the relationship with China was developed by leaps and bounds. The greatest concern of India was the Hambantota port on the eastern seaboard of Sri Lanka. The terms of this deal have been very disadvantageous. The Chinese committed billions of dollars to economic development and infrastructure development in Sri Lanka, but on terms which are very unfavorable. If the Sri Lankans cannot afford to pay back the loan in time, they will have the lease of the land and practically extraterritorial rights there. They are establishing a naval base there, which would allow them to dominate this part of the Indian Ocean very, very well. Now, the Indians have been very apprehensive, but the Indians also should realize that they were not in a position to match the scale of Chinese assistance for this. And we were so worried about rebuilding our relationship with major powers in the world that the smaller neighbor next door remained probably neglected, and this cost us in terms of strategic advantage. We were caught flat-footed as far as China was concerned. But there has been also resentment in Sri Lanka about the Chinese aid, debt trap, etc. And there is no need to emphasize repeatedly and almost make it a wish-fulfilling prophecy that Sri Lanka under Rajapaksa brothers will go and sit in the lap of People's Republic of China. I think India should try to maintain a cordial and friendly relationship with the president who wears his Buddhism on his sleeve, comes to India on a pilgrimage, and it was good that the Indian Prime Minister lost no time in sending him a message of congratulations. We hope that India can break the shackles of the domestic Tamil Nadu politics and look at Sri Lanka purely from the strategic lens of India's national interest. What the world witnessed last week was an extremely innovative diplomatic campaign by China, which can only be termed as vaccine diplomacy. Now, this is interesting. Ever since the corona pandemic has struck the world, international relations have been thrown topsy-turvy. There is speculation about the big powers shrinking in their capacity to project their power abroad, their economies being devastated, there have been conspiracy theories, and China, which has been in the forefront of spreading the corona infection, one is not blaming China for that. It itself was struck very badly with corona pandemic. It is now in the forefront of this vaccine diplomacy. And the most ironical part is that no vaccine has been discovered or developed by now. But the Chinese have taken the initiative of promising $1 billion aid to Latin American countries right in the backyard of America, to tell them that it will make available for them as soon as the vaccine is made available, buy it and make available to them at a very, very concessional rate, which they would not be otherwise able to afford. The China has also made similar offers to some countries in South Asia. It has also made similar offers to countries in Africa, which is very active diplomatically. And the Americans and the others have had to respond to this vaccine diplomacy almost to keep pace with what the Chinese are trying to do to undercut its influence in the world elsewhere. Now, the leading contenders in the discovery of the vaccine, which might run past the winning post first, is Oxford University vaccine, which is being researched in association with the large pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca. And this is the thing in which India also has a stake, because 1 billion or more doses of this vaccine are going to be manufactured by the Premium Institute, Serum Institute of India from Pune, and is also working overtime in Bangalore to make enough number of doses available as soon as the clinical trials are over. The clinical trials, the second and third stage of clinical trials, is normally a very complicated process, but it has been hastened and accelerated in these extraordinary circumstances, and they are just waiting for large-scale trials to begin. And these large-scale trials, as is usually the case with these vaccines or drugs, are not taking place in America, they are not taking place in an affluent Western European country, they are taking place in Brazil, they are taking place partly in other third world countries, and some volunteers, of course, are making themselves available in England, etc. in the lab. But the interesting part is this, that once the vaccine is discovered, some countries have said that they will not profit out of this like they did at the time of the AIDS pandemic. They are saying that they will not profit from this discovery, make it available as a public good to the world at large. But President Trump has already made those noises which are not very reassuring, that America will buy X number of vaccines, the millions of doses for its own people. It is investing in the development of these vaccines, so it should have the first right to get these vaccines. But I think there are other philanthropic organizations like COVAX and like the GAVE. Now, the Bill Gates Foundation has said that it is making available $100 million available to India. So India also can at least have 500,000 doses of this vaccine when they are manufactured in India. But keeping in mind India's large population, this figure is very small. That's one part. The second part is that some economists have also drawn our attention to this thing, that while the money made available for vaccine development is less than 20 billion US dollars, trillions of dollars have been made available for employment regeneration, for restoring health of economy in various developed countries. So there is no correlation. There can be no realistic expectation of the economic recovery unless we can conquer the coronavirus. The coronavirus can only be conquered when an effective vaccine is found out, and when the effective vaccine is found out, it has to be safe, it has to be effective, and it has to be affordable. Now, it is estimated that an average dose of this vaccine will cost about 225 US dollars, which will be almost unaffordable for the average patient in the third world countries. That's where the subsidy coming out from Bill Gates Foundation might be useful. But the point is, India also has been trying to say that we are developing a vaccine on our own. But the Indians have the technical know-how, but the process of developing a new molecular entity, whether it's a vaccine or a miracle drug, is something very different. It follows a certain protocol. But in situations like this, which are warlike, there might be compromises made, that you might make a compromise on side effects, you might make a compromise on safety, you might take a risk and say it is better than no vaccine at all. That's one. And whether it will be prophylactic, will be made available only to coronavirus or the population as large, is another question. But the interesting part is this, that we go back to the vaccine diplomacy of China. The world is suddenly discovering that it depends almost on, for half of its drugs, if not more than half, on supplies coming out of China. It is like the ventilators, it's like the masks, even what they call API, advanced pharmaceutical intermediaries, which form the bulk of the generic drugs. Now, India is one of the largest generic drugs manufacturer in the world. It exports a lot of this to America. And when the Americans say that they are going to reduce their dependence on other countries' production of drugs, it's not only the vaccine. It might be a cure which is to treat the disease after it has already struck a patient. So all kinds of things are up in the air. India is a major player in the pharmaceutical sector, in the generic medical production. But again, India depends on imports of APIs from China. So there is this catch-22 situation. Big pharmaceutical companies like Cipla are also in the game. But whether we will have an indigenous vaccine of our own, which will make us less dependent on the rest of the world and their philanthropy, is a question we'll have to wait and watch. Turkey has been adopting an increasingly aggressive posture in its diplomacy in recent days, and last week was no exception. What Turkey did was something pretty provocative. When French sent a frigate to the northwestern tip of Africa to stop contraband arms from reaching Libya, and the efforts of the Europeans and the United Nations has been to stop arms reaching from any of the factions battling for control there, General Haftar's troops or the recognized government. Turkey sent a larger naval battleship there, and the French frigate, much smaller in size, had to beat a hasty retreat. This was gunboat diplomacy of the old school at its worst. That's one part. And Turkey is an interested party in the civil war in Libya. Turkey did at the other end of the eastern Mediterranean, and there's another bit of provocation. It declared that it had resumed drilling for oil in seabed in its continental shelf, which claims its continental shelf, but there is a dispute about this continental shelf between its neighbors Cyprus and Greece. Now, Turkey's argument is very simple. It says that the continental shelf should be measured from the mainland. It should not be measured from the islands which a sovereign state controls, and this has been an issue of dispute. The Greek argument is that this flies in the face of the international law of seas, and Greece also argues that it already has got an agreement with Egypt to share this oil. Turkey doesn't believe in this. It has resumed the drilling, and this might lead to a confrontation in very near future. Now, this falls in a pattern. Not very long ago, the Hagia Sophia church was converted, the museum was converted into a mosque once again, and President Erdogan performed worship there. And this has been a gradual Islamization of the polity in Turkey. Not only that, it also has been suppression of democratic rights, which the Turkish people have enjoyed ever since the revolution of Kemal Atatürk. Turkey at one stage was considered almost three-fourths a European nation. Turkey was very keen to join the European Union, but now it seems that Turkey has turned its back on the European Union. It probably thinks that the membership of the European Union is not worth its while. What makes things even more complicated is that the Turkey continues to be a member of the NATO, although under President Trump, the NATO's presence in Europe has been devalued. President Trump has said that the forces would be moved from Germany into Poland and so on, and nobody knows what will happen to NATO. It is a different kind of a Cold War. Putin is changing his postures, diplomatic and strategic, in Syria, in Libya and elsewhere. So the Americans have not been quite in a position to deploy NATO against it. So the problem is that if Turkey continues to be a member of NATO, has neither been expelled nor does it go out on itself, what kind of an action can the Western, so far allies of Turkey, take against it? Erdogan is not very willing to listen to sage advice. Let's also say that Turkey has been implicated in the murder of Khashoggi, the journalist, who was killed in a consulate, Saudi Arabian consulate in Turkey itself. Turkey has been also maligned for running roughshod of the human rights of the Kurds, and everybody thinks that the Turkey is trying to go back to the glorious past of the Byzantine Empire, trying to take advantage of its strategic location on three continents, Europe, Asia and Africa, and trying to assert itself as if it is an independent power in the region. It is also, against the American advice, acquired S-400 missiles from Russia. So it's a very, very complex diplomatic game which Turkey is trying to play, getting arms from Russia, trying to project its power, provoke its European allies in Libya and Northwest Africa. There is oil very much there. And the Kurds also control some oil in the territories which claim there's Kurdistan. So Turkey is going to be, it thinks, a linchpin in politics in this area, and let's see how things develop. But whatever happens, Turkey is again going to be a destabilizing factor rather than a factor in favor of stability. From India's point of view, a distressing development in South Asia, in its immediate neighborhood, was a jailbreak in Afghanistan. This was in the eastern part of Afghanistan, in a town called Jalalabad, where in a prison, almost 1,800 prisoners were kept together. Most of them were activists of ISIS, the Islamic State, and some Talibans. And as you may recollect, there has been a major issue in negotiations between the United States of America and the Taliban, that the Taliban prisoners should be released immediately. Close to 500 to 600 prisoners, Taliban prisoners, remain in jails. And this has been a bone of contention between the present government in Kabul and the Taliban. What happened in this case was that the jailbreak was unexpected and massive, and out of 1,800 prisoners, almost 12 to 1,300 prisoners broke out. Only 350 to 400 prisoners who were probably not in a position to go out, either drug addicts or sick or scared, did not move out. Now, according to the authorities, the Afghan authorities, they have succeeded in recapturing about 400-500 prisoners, but 1,000 prisoners did manage to break free. Now, all the 10 people who had assaulted the prison were killed in a gunfight. Lots of civilians lost life. The loss of life of prisoners in the crossfire and the civilians probably touches close to 70. We'll never know the exact figures from Afghanistan. But the distressing part, and the part which perturbs us most, is this, that this seems to indicate that in the eastern part of Afghanistan, after the negotiations with Taliban of the US to withdraw from the landlocked country, influence of the Islamic State has increased. But there is even a more interesting conspiracy theory which says that the Taliban wanted to have the jailbreak, but wanted to have the plausible deniability with the Americans and blamed it on the ISIS. So the jailbreak, for all we know, might have been effected by the Taliban warlords to release their comrades, and they blamed it with the connivance, compliance of the ISIS. Even otherwise, in Afghanistan, the situation is so complex and fluid that most people who work in the intelligence agencies of United States, of even Indian intelligence agencies and the other foreign agencies are generally in agreement that it's very difficult to distinguish between those who support the ISIS and those who claim to be Taliban, and is even more difficult to distinguish between the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. And somebody as brutal, as sadistic as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar is now once again part of the government in Kabul. So it is very difficult to say which side they are on. As far as the Taliban and ISIS are concerned, both of them subscribe to the ideology of dogmatic, aggressive, intolerant Islam. There is only a difference of degrees. So they can very easily change sides, change colors. And Afghanistan has long been divided by warlords in their territories, where they grow opium, they indulge in piracy of drugs and illicit arms. So it is very difficult to imagine that this was either entirely an ISIS. It's difficult to believe, or it is the Taliban were not complicit in this. But the fact remains that the government in Kabul is slowly losing control. And once Americans are all gone, the Taliban and ISIS people, the Mujahideen, which fought bloody wars in past, may not necessarily be fighting a war. There might be faction fights. There might be bloodbaths and coups within various factions. But the hopes of having a stable, democratic, more or less modern government in Afghanistan would be gone. And with that would sink the hopes of fighting for the COVID pandemic effectively, or to control the drug trade or the influx of arms from Afghanistan to the neighborhood of Pakistan. Even a more worrisome development in this whole incident is that of the two people, members of the suicide squad which attacked this prison, were of Indian origin. There was a doctor who had joined ISIS some time back from Kerala, and other person has been also identified from very close to his village, Kasargod in Kerala. Now this is ringing warning bells. If the Islamic Caliphate has been successful in indoctrinating professionals in Kerala, they probably can be used as sleeping cells to perpetrate terrorist attacks, not only in Afghanistan, but in India itself. This is something which we have to guard against, and the spillover from violence of Afghanistan through Pakistan to Kashmir is also a very real threat. It is clear by now that the President Trump of the United States of America has decided that he will retain a confrontationist posture against China, at least till the elections are over. He wants to project himself as the strongest president of the United States who taught China a lesson. He is the one who initiated a trade war against China, and part of this trade war has now come to banning something called TikTok. Now, you would recall that India has also banned 57, 58 applications of Chinese origin, and one of them is TikTok. But the amusing part is that TikTok is not something like Huawei, where the security of a nation is really at stake because the information from sensitive telecom networks can be passed on straight to the Chinese government. It is an application which is of short duration videos, very popular with teenagers. Some people have become millionaires posting their TikTok videos. Some have committed suicide when their fan following has come down. But why should TikTok be targeted? Now, both for India and America, the argument is the same, that you never can tell with China. A seemingly innocuous, innocent application might be the Trojan horse. It might be a company like WeByte, Dance Bytes, WeChat, may not be companies owned directly by the Chinese government, but they may have links with the Chinese state apparatus about, and you don't even know what is happening, what kind of big data is being collected, what use it is going to be put to. There also is an interesting thing that the WeChat is an application which President Trump has banned, which is mostly used by Chinese to communicate with each other outside America. But this is not what is the issue which is of international relations interest. It is tangentially of our interest, but what is more interesting is that President Trump came out with an offer. He had last week called the four big tech giants and given them why they should not be broken down. They had a congressional hearing and so on. But one of them, Microsoft, was not represented there. And now what is happening is that Microsoft has been asked by the Americans to buy TikTok within 45 days because President has said he will not allow TikTok to operate in America after 45 days. So either they sell out to an American company, lock, stock and barrel, or they move out. Obviously, TikTok, company that owns us, is very worried about that. And also, Trump's typical manner, he has made very interesting statements. He said that the money which Microsoft pays out to TikTok and the money which it makes out of TikTok's business, major part of it should go to American Treasury, because TikTok has benefited from business in America. Now, this is against the canons of capitalism, against the canon of free trade, against the canon of commercial rights, as long as they exist legally. I don't know whether the president can do it even with an executive order, but then president, of course, in his typical manner, retracted from this statement. Microsoft has come out with very interesting statements saying that it is sensitive to the concerns of the United States of America, which means that the Microsoft in the end might make an investment in buying TikTok. And what would happen, we shall see in coming days. But is this going to set a pattern that can the American big business become as much a part of the American state as it is accusing the Chinese companies to be? So whether it is Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, whether it is Google, whether it is Amazon, everybody seems to be converging towards the authoritarian control of both business and democratic processes. What is interesting is at the same time, President Trump has kept up his propaganda and rhetoric that foreign countries are trying to destabilize, influence American elections. The Chinese want Trump to be defeated. The Russians want him in place, who of course doesn't say so explicitly, but this is what is being speculated all over. So in this case, social media becomes important, and social media, which is controlled by the Chinese, is even more important in the context of the American presidential elections and the divisions within the Western family. Certain European nations have come out strict, including not why only Western nations. Some Americans also say this is a matter of parental concern, how their children are using or abusing or wasting time on TikTok and WeChat. There is no real evidence of national security having been threatened. But this is something which President Trump at least is very worried about, and one big American corporation is taking it seriously. The misery of the Latin American countries continues unabated. President Bolsonaro has recovered from his COVID infection, but this has not made a difference to his blighted country. The misgovernance continues, resentment against him continues, and his total inability to control anything, neither economy or the coronavirus pandemic, the failure is glaring. To make matters worse, the fires have broken out once again in the Amazon rainforest, and there is no time which anybody, or attention or resources which anybody can devote to controlling these fires. Now, this is not the time to say that these have erupted because of misgovernance, of short-sightedness of the present government in past, but the problem is that this is going to make the economic recovery even more difficult and the resentment against Bolsonaro more. It's not only Brazil which is happening. Brazil is the first affected country in terms of infections, and if you take the proportion of deaths in relation to the total population, it is very badly struck. It is also the neighboring countries of Argentina and Chile, which were already suffering economic depression, economic shrinkage of their GDP, are very badly struck by the coronavirus. Neighboring countries adjacent to Brazil, Chile and Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Peru, again are in a very bad shape. They already were suffering from economic slowdown, inflation, etc. Right now what is happening is that people are saying in countries like Bolivia that those of us who were in slums are now out on the streets. We are begging for food. Now, these are countries which were at one stage, like in Venezuela, sitting on a rich resource base of oils. So whether it is Colombia, Venezuela, whether it is Nicaragua, every country is busy either settling scores with politicians who are now out of power, or with resentment bursting out against people who are incapable of governing their countries but retain in power. There doesn't seem to be a hope for these countries, and America, which always came to their rescue or aid even at the cost of destroying the democratic structure, is no longer in a position to do so on its own. It is not only the countries in Latin America. Perhaps one could argue and say a little further that is the whole of the southern hemisphere which is suddenly facing this problem. South Africa is having the same problem, economic slowdown, coronavirus, and even Australia, a continent unto itself, which thought that it had managed the coronavirus very well, now is having an almost emergency-like situation and imposing imposing curfews in Victoria, Melbourne, in other major cities of the country. And I think they are not out of the woods. They again are faced with forest fires in this season. And again, I think there'll be very little time to control this environmental calamity as long as they are grappling with the coronavirus. The tensions between United States of America and Canada keeps resurfacing in different areas. The extradition of the Chinese lady Miss Meng of Huawei family is one issue, but more is that Donald Trump has suddenly also announced that he is going to remove the concessions given to Canadian aluminum being imported from that country. So there, one irritant is resolved and another hardly resolved and another crops up. So I think this position is very difficult to grapple at the same time, and it is not only the American continent. If you come to Europe, the economies have shrunk of major countries like France and Germany by 10 to 12 to 13%, and some of the more grief-stricken countries like Spain and Portugal, there the economy is shrinking even larger by 15% or so. So it is difficult to imagine that however big the package, the trillion euros package, it will be sufficient to restore economic health to them. So we are in for times which are disturbing, which are distressing, not only for these countries, but for all, because no man is an island unto itself, as John Donne says. The complex web of international relations and trade weaves us together in the age of globalization. This is all we have for you this time. We shall be back next week with another selection of international events, which we hope you will find informative and useful. We'll analyze them for you with the Indo-centric perspective, and we shall also try to analyze for you the interrelationship between various events that take place on different continents in different countries. Goodbye till then.